Case 1. Mitchell Blair. August 2012 through May 2013. Discovery March 24, 2015. Wayne County Circuit Court, Detroit, Michigan. Tonight's case is one of the most widely discussed criminal investigations in Detroit history. A case that began with what appeared to be a routine eviction process and quickly turned into a major law enforcement investigation. On March 24, 2015, workers arrived at a Detroit apartment complex to carry out a court-ordered eviction. What authorities discovered inside the residence would soon bring Wayne County investigators, prosecutors, and forensic specialists to the scene. This documentary examines the official investigation, the court proceedings, and the lasting impact this case had on everyone involved. There are cases that the legal system is asked to reckon with that arrive not through the work of investigators following a trail of evidence, not through a tip that reaches a detective's desk, not through any of the formal mechanisms of child protection and law enforcement that communities build and fund precisely because children need protection. There are cases that surface through the most ordinary of administrative processes: an eviction notice, a crew dispatched to carry out a routine legal order, a door that opens onto something no one who walked through it that morning had any reason to expect. The case of Mitchell Blair is one of those cases. It arrived on March 24, 2015, in a Detroit apartment complex, when an eviction crew made entry into a residential unit and discovered something inside that would bring Wayne County investigators, prosecutors, and the full weight of Michigan's criminal justice system into motion immediately. Mitchell Blair was a mother of 4 children. She lived in a unit within a Detroit apartment complex with those children. She was, to the people around her, neighbors, people who passed her in the hallways of the building, people who had ordinary, unremarkable interactions with her over the years she lived there, a woman whose home life was not a subject of formal concern. There had been no sustained investigation. There had been no active child welfare file that had flagged her household as a place requiring urgent intervention. The systems that exist to identify and respond to children in danger had not converged on Mitchell Blair's apartment in the years between 2012 and 2015. Stephen Barry Jr. was 8 years old in the summer of 2012. He was Mitchell Blair's son. He did not survive that summer. Wayne County investigators, working from the evidence assembled in the immediate aftermath of the March 2015 discovery, established that Stephen had been subjected to severe and prolonged harm inside the family's home, harm that resulted in his death in August of 2012. His remains were not reported to authorities. They were concealed inside a freezer in the apartment, and the family, including Mitchell Blair and the 2 surviving children who remained in the home, continued to live in that apartment in the months and years that followed. Stoney Blair was 13 years old in the spring of 2013. She was Mitchell Blair's daughter. She did not survive that spring. The investigative record established by Wayne County law enforcement determined that Stoney had also been subjected to severe harm inside the family's residence, harm that resulted in her death in May of 2013. Her remains were also placed in the freezer inside the apartment. And again, the household continued. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Months became years. By the time the eviction crew arrived at the apartment on March 24, 2015, Stephen had been gone for approximately 2 years and 7 months. Stoney had been gone for approximately 1 year and 10 months. The 2 surviving children of Mitchell Blair had been living in that apartment, in the physical proximity of the freezer that contained the remains of their siblings, for that entire period. The discovery made by the eviction crew on March 24, 2015, brought Detroit police and Wayne County investigators to the scene immediately. The evidence they documented, the physical contents of the freezer, the condition of the apartment, the statements gathered from the surviving children and from individuals connected to the family, formed the foundation of a criminal case that Wayne County prosecutors built against Mitchell Blair in the weeks and months that followed. The investigation required the kind of careful, methodical assembly of evidence that Wayne County's forensic and investigative teams are trained to conduct in circumstances of extreme complexity. The medical examiner's work, the forensic documentation of the scene, and the interviews conducted with the surviving children, conducted with the particular care that child witnesses require, particularly children who had themselves been living in circumstances of profound trauma, all contributed to the evidentiary record that Wayne County prosecutors would present in court. What prosecutors established was not simply that Stephen and Stoney had lost their lives inside that apartment. They established the nature of what had preceded their deaths, the pattern of harm, the period over which that harm had occurred, and the decisions that Mitchell Blair had made in the aftermath of each death. The decision not to call for help. The decision to conceal. The decision to continue living in that apartment with the remaining children while the freezer in the basement held what it held. Mitchell Blair was charged in Wayne County Circuit Court with the first-degree premeditated murder of both Stephen Barry Jr. and Stoney Blair. The case that prosecutors presented was one of the most extensively documented cases of its kind in Wayne County's recent history. The evidence was substantial. The surviving children's accounts, gathered by investigators with the assistance of child trauma specialists, contributed to the record in ways that the court took seriously. In 2015, Mitchell Blair was convicted in Wayne County Circuit Court. The verdict was first-degree murder on both counts. The sentence handed down by the Wayne County Circuit Court was life in prison without the possibility of parole. She was remanded to the Michigan Department of Corrections and will not be released. The two surviving children of Mitchell Blair entered the Michigan child welfare system in the aftermath of the March 2015 discovery. They had experienced a childhood that no child welfare framework is fully equipped to address after the fact. Years of living in circumstances that investigators and mental health professionals who worked with them described as profoundly harmful. The work of supporting those children, the therapeutic, educational, and placement work that followed, was taken on by Wayne County's child welfare infrastructure and the foster and adoptive families who received them. Stephen Barry Jr. was 8 years old. Stoney Blair was 13 years old. They lost their lives inside a Detroit apartment, in the care of their mother, in a household that the systems designed to protect them had not reached in time. The Wayne County Circuit Court's verdict and sentence represent the legal system's full accounting for what Mitchell Blair did. The permanence of a life without parole sentence is the court's permanent statement about the gravity of what occurred in that apartment between 2012 and 2013. The Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline, 1-800-422-4453. Case 2, Azuradee, France, early 2022. Discovery June 24, 2022. Wayne County Circuit Court, Detroit, Michigan. There are cases where the mechanism of discovery is a welfare check, a visit by law enforcement prompted by a concern raised by someone who noticed something, by a relative who could not reach a family member, by any of the informal social connections that occasionally function as the early warning system that formal institutions are not always able to provide. The case of Azuradee, France, investigated by Detroit police and prosecuted in Wayne County Circuit Court following events that occurred in Detroit in the early months of 2022, is a case of this kind. The welfare check that brought investigators to her home on June 24, 2022, was the moment at which the truth of what had happened to a 3-year-old boy named Chas France moved from the concealment of a private residence into the documented record of Wayne County law enforcement. Chas France was 3 years old. He was Azuradee France's son. He had been alive, had been a toddler in the earliest years of his childhood, at the age when children are learning to speak in full sentences, developing the individual personality that makes them distinct, building the small daily routines and preferences that are the texture of a young life. In the period before the early months of 2022. What Wayne County investigators established through the evidence documented at the scene and the forensic and medical examination that followed is that Chas had not survived into the spring of that year. He had lost his life in the early months of 2022. And the decision that Azuradee France made in the aftermath of his death was not to contact emergency services, not to seek help from anyone in a position to respond, but to conceal his remains inside a freezer in the basement of the family's Detroit home. The welfare check that brought Detroit police to the residence on June 24, 2022, was therefore not the discovery of an ongoing crisis. It was the discovery of a concealment that had been in place for months. The officers who conducted the check and made entry into the home found the freezer in the basement and, within it, the remains of Chas France. He was 3 years old. The Detroit police investigation that followed worked in conjunction with Wayne County's forensic investigators and the medical examiner's office to establish the circumstances of Chas's death, the cause, the timing, and the actions taken by Azuradee France in the period between his death and the June 24th discovery. The evidence assembled by investigators formed the basis for the criminal charges that Wayne County prosecutors filed against France. The parallel between the France case and the Blair case, both involving a Detroit mother, both involving a freezer, both involving a period of concealment that stretched across months, was not lost on the Wayne County legal community or on the child welfare advocates and law enforcement professionals who reviewed both cases. Two separate instances, separated by years, in which a child's remains had been concealed in a freezer inside a Detroit home, both eventually surfacing through external intervention rather than any voluntary disclosure. The pattern prompted discussions within Detroit's child welfare and law enforcement communities about the nature of concealment in cases of this kind, and about the investigative protocols that should govern welfare check responses in circumstances where a child has not been seen or accounted for over an extended period. Azuradee France was charged in Wayne County Circuit Court with first-degree felony murder and first-degree child abuse. The case that prosecutors built was grounded in the physical evidence, the forensic findings, and the established timeline of Chas's death and the subsequent concealment of his remains. Wayne County Circuit Court heard the case and arrived at a verdict of guilty on both counts, first-degree felony murder and child abuse. The sentence handed down was life in prison. Azuradee France was remanded to the Michigan Department of Corrections. Chas France was 3 years old. He was at an age where the world is still mostly new, where every experience carries the particular freshness of early childhood, where the people responsible for a child's care are the entire architecture of that child's safety and understanding. He deserved that safety. He deserved the protection and nurturing that a 3-year-old requires and is owed. What he received instead, and what Wayne County Circuit Court formally documented and adjudicated, resulted in a life sentence for his mother and a permanent entry in the legal record of Detroit's most consequential criminal cases. The accountability that Wayne County Circuit Court delivered in the France case reflects the court's judgment about the gravity of what had been done to Chas. Not only his death, but the months of concealment that followed, the decision to deny him even the dignity of a reported death, the extended period during which his 3-year-old remains lay hidden, while the legal and social systems that should have known he existed remained unaware of what had happened to him. Please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Every case on this channel represents a life that deserves to be remembered and a story that deserves to be told responsibly. Subscribe and hit the bell notification so you are always informed when a new episode is published. Case 3, Brandee Pierce, October 24th, 2024, Discovery January 6th, 2025, Wayne County Circuit Court, Detroit, Michigan. There are cases where the discovery of what happened to a child comes not through a welfare check, not through an eviction crew, but through the most ordinary encounter between a landlord and a property, a routine visit to a rental home, the kind of inspection or access that property owners conduct regularly and without any expectation of finding anything beyond the normal evidence of occupancy. The case of Brandee Pierce, investigated by Detroit police and being processed through Wayne County Circuit Court following events that occurred on October 24, 2024, is a case of this kind. The discovery that brought law enforcement to a Detroit rental property on January 6, 2025, was made by a landlord. And what that landlord found in the backyard of that property on that January morning set in motion a Wayne County investigation and prosecution that is among the most recently documented cases of its kind in Detroit's legal history. Zemar King, 3, was 9 years old. He was Brandee Pierce's son. On October 24, 2024, Zemar lost his life inside a rental home in Detroit. The investigative record assembled by Wayne County law enforcement in the aftermath of the January 6 discovery established what had happened to Zemar inside that home, the nature of the harm he had experienced, and the sequence of events that had followed his death. Brandee Pierce had not contacted emergency services. She had not sought help. Instead, according to the evidence documented by investigators, she had made a series of deliberate decisions in the hours and days after Zemar's death that reflected not a state of panic or confusion, but a calculated effort to conceal what had occurred. She purchased a shovel. She bound Zemar's limbs. She buried him in a shallow grave in the backyard of the rental property. And then she left Detroit. She traveled to Georgia, putting geographic distance between herself and the Detroit property where Zemar lay buried in the yard. For approximately 2 months and 13 days, from October 24, 2024 to January 6, 2025, Zemar King III lay in that shallow backyard grave while his mother was in another state. He was 9 years old. He had been in the 4th year of elementary school. He had been at an age where children are developing academically, socially, athletically, building the competencies and connections that will carry them forward into adolescence and adulthood. None of that future was available to him after October 24th. The discovery on January 6, 2025, occurred when the landlord of the rental property made a visit and noticed something in the backyard that should not have been there. Zemar's feet were visible above the surface of the ground. The landlord contacted emergency services. Detroit police responded and secured the scene. The investigation that followed brought Wayne County's forensic and investigative resources to bear on everything that the property and the evidence could tell them about what had happened to Zemar and what Brandee Pierce had done in the aftermath of his death. The investigation extended to Georgia, where Brandee Pierce had traveled after leaving Detroit. Wayne County law enforcement worked with Georgia authorities to locate and apprehend her. She was extradited to Michigan to face criminal proceedings in Wayne County Circuit Court. The extradition process, the formal legal mechanism by which a person who has left the jurisdiction where they are charged is returned to face those charges, was completed, and Pierce was returned to Detroit to face the Wayne County legal system. The charges filed against Brandee Pierce in Wayne County Circuit Court were first-degree premeditated murder, Michigan's most serious homicide charge, reflecting the prosecution's position that what had happened to Zemar on October 24, 2024, was not the result of accident or impulsive action but of deliberate, premeditated intent. The legal proceedings advanced through Wayne County's court system during 2025. Pierce was bound over to stand trial in Wayne County Circuit Court on the first-degree premeditated murder charge. As of the production of this documentary, the trial of Brandee Pierce in Wayne County Circuit Court represents the next stage of the legal proceedings in this case. The evidence assembled by Detroit police and Wayne County investigators, including the physical evidence from the rental property, the forensic findings, the documentation of the purchases made after Zemar's death, and the circumstances of Pierce's departure from Detroit, forms the evidentiary foundation that the Wayne County prosecution will present to a jury. Zemar King III was 9 years old. He was a child. He was in someone's care. He deserved protection, safety, and the ordinary continuation of a childhood that had years still ahead of it. The Wayne County Circuit Court proceedings that are ongoing represent the legal system's effort to deliver the accountability that Zemar is owed, to examine the evidence, hear the case, and arrive at a verdict that reflects the full weight of what happened to him on October 24, 2024, in a Detroit rental home. The ongoing nature of this case means that the final chapter of the Wayne County Circuit Court's response to Zemar's death has not yet been written. But the fact that Brandee Pierce was extradited, returned to Detroit, and bound over for trial is itself a statement of accountability, a signal from Wayne County's legal system that the geographic distance she had placed between herself and the evidence did not place her beyond the reach of Michigan's courts. If this case has moved you, please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you are the first to know when updates on this case and others are published on this channel. Case 4, Jennifer Crumbley, November 30, 2021, Oakland County Circuit Court, Pontiac, Michigan. There are cases that do not fit the conventional pattern of criminal prosecution. Cases where the question being asked of the court is not whether a person directly caused a harm, but whether their decisions, their choices, their failures to act created the conditions in which a devastating harm became possible. The case of Jennifer Crumbley is a case of this kind. It is a case that Oakland County prosecutors brought before a Michigan court in the aftermath of one of the most significant acts of school violence in Michigan's history, a case that asked a jury to consider a legal theory of accountability that no American court had ever successfully applied before in comparable circumstances. And it is a case that, in early 2024, resulted in a verdict that legal scholars, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and child safety advocates across the United States immediately recognized as a landmark moment in American criminal law. The events of November 30th, 2021, occurred at Oxford High School in Oxford Township, Oakland County, Michigan, approximately 40 miles north of Detroit. On that day, a 15-year-old student opened fire inside the school. 4 students lost their lives. 7 additional people sustained injuries. The shooting was among the deadliest school shootings in Michigan history, and its impact on the Oxford community, on Oakland County, and on the broader national conversation about school safety was immediate and lasting. The 15-year-old who carried out the shooting was Jennifer Crumbley's son. He was a student at Oxford High School. He was 15 years old. And in the weeks, months, and ultimately years that followed November 30th, 2021, the Oakland County investigation and prosecution did something unusual, something that reflected a determination by Oakland County prosecutor Karen McDonald and her team to hold not only the shooter accountable, but the adults in his life whose decisions and failures had, prosecutors argued, directly contributed to the conditions that made November 30th possible. Jennifer Crumbley and her husband, James Crumbley, were both charged in Oakland County Circuit Court. The charges against Jennifer Crumbley were 4 counts of involuntary manslaughter, 1 count for each of the 4 students who had lost their lives on November 30th. The theory of prosecution was grounded in a documented record of what Jennifer Crumbley had known, what she had been told, and what she had chosen not to do in the period leading up to the shooting. The prosecution presented evidence of her son's documented mental distress, evidence that had been available to her, that had been communicated to her, that she had had every opportunity to respond to and had not. The prosecution also presented evidence related to a firearm, a weapon that Jennifer and James Crumbley had purchased for their son and that was used in the November 30th shooting. The trial of Jennifer Crumbley in Oakland County Circuit Court in early 2024 was closely watched by legal professionals, criminal justice scholars, and child safety advocates across the country. The central question the jury was asked to answer was whether Jennifer Crumbley's decisions, the decisions she made and did not make in the weeks and months before November 30th, constituted the kind of gross negligence that Michigan's criminal law requires for an involuntary manslaughter conviction. Whether her failure to respond to the warning signs she had been given and her role in the acquisition of the firearm that her son would use rose to the level of criminal accountability. The Oakland County jury returned a verdict of guilty on all 4 counts of involuntary manslaughter. Jennifer Crumbley became the first parent in United States legal history to be convicted of involuntary manslaughter for a school shooting carried out by their child. The verdict was immediately recognized as a landmark by legal commentators across the country, as a precedent-setting outcome that expanded the framework of parental criminal accountability in American law in a way that no previous case had achieved. The sentence handed down by Oakland County Circuit Court was 10 to 15 years in prison. Jennifer Crumbley was remanded to the Michigan Department of Corrections to begin serving that sentence. The 4 students who lost their lives at Oxford High School on November 30th, 2021, were Madison Baldwin, Tate Meyer, Hannah St. Juliana, and Justin Schilling. They were teenagers. They had gone to school on an ordinary Tuesday morning in November and had not come home. Their families and the Oxford community carried the weight of that day into the legal proceedings that followed and will carry it long after those proceedings have concluded. The Oakland County Circuit Court's verdict in the Crumbley case sent a message that the American legal system had not previously delivered with this directness and finality. That parents who have documented knowledge of a child's dangerous mental state, who take actions that provide that child with access to lethal means, and who fail to intervene when intervention was both possible and necessary, can be held criminally accountable for the consequences of those failures. It is a message that child safety advocates and school safety professionals have pointed to in the months since the verdict as a potential deterrent, as a legal framework that creates accountability not only after a tragedy, but as a warning to parents about the nature of their responsibilities. Please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. This case changed American legal history. Your subscription supports a channel committed to documenting cases like this one with the seriousness and depth they deserve. Subscribe and ring the bell. Case 5, Charla Pendergrass, April 5, 2025. Discovery, April 26, 2025. Wayne County 3rd Judicial Circuit Court, Southfield, Michigan. There are cases where the criminal accountability being sought by prosecutors extends beyond the person who directly carried out a harmful act. Cases where the evidence points to a second individual whose role was not that of a bystander, not that of someone who failed to intervene, but of someone who directed, commanded, and orchestrated what occurred. The case of Charla Pendergrass, currently being processed through Wayne County's 3rd Judicial Circuit Court following events that occurred in April of 2025, is a case of this kind. It is a case in which a 17-year-old named London Thomas lost his life, and in which the evidence assembled by investigators and presented to the court pointed not only to the person who physically carried out the act, but to a mother who, according to witness testimony, had given the order. London Thomas was 17 years old. He was a young person at the threshold of adulthood, old enough to have plans and aspirations, old enough to be building the relationships and experiences that would have carried him forward, not old enough to have had the full opportunity to become who he was going to be. On April 5, 2025, London Thomas lost his life. He did not survive an encounter with Charla Pendergrass's son, Jalen Pendergrass, in the Detroit area. The manner of his death, established by investigators and documented in the Wayne County court record, involved a form of asphyxia. His remains were concealed, sealed inside a plastic storage bin, and hidden in an SUV in Southfield, Michigan. The discovery of London Thomas's remains on April 26, 2025, 21 days after his death, brought Southfield police and Wayne County investigators to the scene and set in motion the criminal proceedings that followed. The investigation assembled by law enforcement in the weeks and months after the discovery produced an evidentiary record that extended beyond Jalen Pendergrass to his mother, Charla. The element of the case that elevated Charla Pendergrass from a potential accessory-level charge to the most serious charges Michigan law provides was witness testimony. Testimony gathered by investigators from individuals with direct knowledge of what had occurred around the time of London Thomas's death established, according to prosecutors, that Charla Pendergrass had not merely been present or aware of what her son was doing. She had, witnesses stated, explicitly directed him to carry out the act that resulted in London Thomas's death. She had given the command. If that testimony is established at trial, if a Wayne County jury accepts the witness accounts and the supporting evidence that prosecutors present, it would mean that London Thomas lost his life not because of an impulsive act by a young man acting alone, but because a mother had used her son as an instrument of violence, had directed him to take a life, and had then been part of the effort to conceal what had been done. In January of 2026, a judge in Wayne County's legal system reviewed the charges against Charla Pendergrass and made an official determination that the evidence was sufficient to upgrade those charges. The judge officially elevated the charges against Charla Pendergrass to first-degree premeditated murder, felony murder, and unlawful imprisonment. She was bound over to stand trial in Wayne County's 3rd Judicial Circuit Court, the same court that handles the most serious criminal cases in Wayne County's jurisdiction. As of the production of this documentary, the trial of Charla Pendergrass in Wayne County's 3rd Judicial Circuit Court represents the next stage of the legal proceedings in this case. The evidence that Wayne County prosecutors will present, the witness testimony, the forensic findings, the documentation of London Thomas's remains, and the circumstances of their concealment, will be tested before a jury that will be asked to determine whether Charla Pendergrass bears criminal responsibility for what happened to London Thomas on April 5, 2025. London Thomas was 17 years old. He was a young man whose life ended before it had fully begun, before he had the opportunity to build the adult life that was ahead of him. The Wayne County 3rd Judicial Circuit Court proceedings represent the legal system's effort to deliver the accountability he is owed. If you are following the Pendergrass case, subscribe to Cold Case Hour for continued coverage. Like this video, leave a comment, and hit the notification bell to stay connected to this channel and its ongoing coverage of Michigan's most significant criminal cases. We couldn't verify Case 6, so because of that, we won't be adding it here. At Cold Case Hour, we're committed to bringing you guys only verified cases. So, let's move on to Case 7. Case 7, Cortney Bartholomew, November 3, 2025. Discovery November 25, 2025. Michigan Attorney General, Wexford County, Cadillac area, Michigan. There are cases where the nature of what investigators discover in the course of their work reaches a level of severity that prompts the involvement of the highest levels of a state's law enforcement and prosecutorial infrastructure. Cases where the standard county-level response, though professional and thorough, is deemed insufficient to the magnitude of what the evidence reveals, and where the state's top law enforcement official steps in to ensure that the full prosecutorial authority of Michigan is brought to bear on what occurred. The case of Courtney Bartholomew and her husband, Bradley Bartholomew, is a case of this kind. It is a case that did not occur in Detroit. It occurred in Wexford County, in the Cadillac area of northern Michigan, in the vast and remote expanse of the Manistee National Forest. But it is a case that, by the gravity of its documented facts, the seriousness with which Michigan's Attorney General's office has treated it, and the profound questions it raises about the nature of a mother's relationship with her own child, belongs in any serious documentary examination of the most consequential criminal cases involving a Michigan mother in the current record. Rebecca Park was 22 years old. She was Courtney Bartholomew's daughter, her biological child, someone who had grown from infancy through childhood and into young adulthood in a relationship with the woman who had given birth to her. She was 38 weeks pregnant at the time of her death. Days, or perhaps a week or two from the delivery of a child she was preparing to welcome into the world. She had reached the final stretch of her pregnancy, the period where expectant mothers are typically surrounded by family, by preparation, by the anticipation of a new life about to begin. She was, in every measurable and human sense, at the threshold of a major life event, a moment that should have been surrounded by safety, by love, by the support of the people closest to her. On November 3, 2025, Courtney Bartholomew and her husband, Bradley Bartholomew, made contact with Rebecca Park. What investigators established in the aftermath of the November 25th discovery is that this contact was not casual or coincidental. It was not the kind of ordinary family interaction that occurs between a mother and an adult daughter. The evidence indicated that Courtney and Bradley Bartholomew had engaged in deliberate planning in the period leading up to November 3rd. They had lured Rebecca to a specific location, specifically into the Manistee National Forest in northern Michigan, under circumstances that the investigation determined were designed to give them access to her in a remote, isolated setting far from any assistance, far from any witness, far from any possibility of intervention. The Manistee National Forest covers hundreds of thousands of acres of northern Michigan's landscape. It is a place of trails and waterways, of dense woodland and seasonal remoteness. It is not a place where a person in distress can easily call for help or expect to be found quickly. The choice of that location, the deliberate selection of a remote forest setting for what the investigation established was a planned encounter, was itself part of the evidentiary picture that Michigan's investigators documented and that the Attorney General's office incorporated into the charges that followed. What happened to Rebecca Park in the Manistee National Forest on November 3, 2025, was documented by investigators from the Michigan Attorney General's office and local law enforcement in the weeks between November 3 and the discovery on November 25. Rebecca had been subjected to extreme violence by the two people who had brought her there. She did not survive. She had been stabbed. And in an act that placed this case among the most disturbing in Michigan's recent criminal history, her unborn child, 38 weeks along, days from birth, was also lost as a result of what Courtney and Bradley Bartholomew did in that forest. The discovery of Rebecca's remains on November 25, 2025, 22 days after November 3, brought investigators to the scene and set in motion a response of a scope that ultimately reached the Michigan Attorney General's office directly. The involvement of the Attorney General in the prosecution of this case, rather than the county-level prosecutor's office, was not a routine administrative decision. It reflected a determination at the highest level of Michigan's law enforcement structure that the severity of what had occurred, the nature of the planning that preceded it, and the public interest in ensuring a thorough and fully resourced prosecution all pointed to state-level involvement as the appropriate response. Courtney Bartholomew and Bradley Bartholomew were indicted by the Michigan Attorney General on charges of first-degree premeditated murder, felony murder, torture, and assault on a pregnant individual. Each charge in the indictment reflects a specific dimension of what investigators had established: the premeditation, the deliberate planning, the nature of the violence, and the particular legal recognition that Rebecca Park was pregnant at the time of her death. The indictment is comprehensive, and it reflects the Attorney General's determination that the evidence supports the most serious charges Michigan law provides. The case of Courtney Bartholomew raises questions that go beyond the specific facts of what happened in November of 2025. It raises questions about the nature of a maternal relationship that could deteriorate, or that could have been constructed from the beginning, in a way that made the planning and execution of November 3rd possible. What history existed between Courtney Bartholomew and her daughter Rebecca Park? What circumstances, what grievances, what breakdown of the most fundamental human bond preceded the events of that day? These are questions that the Michigan Attorney General's prosecution will be asked to address as the case moves toward trial, and they are questions that the broader community will grapple with regardless of what the legal proceedings ultimately establish. Rebecca Park was 22 years old. She was 38 weeks pregnant. She had trusted, or had been persuaded to enter, a situation and a location from which she did not return. She had been at the point in her life where a new chapter was about to begin, where she was on the verge of becoming a mother herself, of bringing a child into the world. That chapter was closed on November 3rd, 2025, in a northern Michigan forest, by the people who should have been among the most reliable sources of safety in her life. The Michigan Attorney General's indictment of Cortney and Bradley Bartholomew is the legal system's response to what was done to Rebecca and to the child she was carrying, a response that carries the full weight of the state's prosecutorial authority and the most serious charges available under Michigan law. The case is ongoing, and the full accounting of what occurred in the Manistee National Forest on November 3rd, 2025, will be delivered when the proceedings in Michigan's courts reach their conclusion. Please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Cases like Rebecca Park's deserve the full attention of a community committed to accountability and justice. Subscribe, leave a comment, and ring the notification bell so you are always informed when this channel publishes new episodes and case updates. Case 8. Valeria Lynn Hamilton, January 2023, Wayne County Circuit Court, Detroit, Michigan. There are cases where the evidence assembled by investigators presents a picture not of a single catastrophic event, but of a sustained pattern, a pattern that developed over a period of time, that left a documented record in the physical and medical evidence, and that speaks not to a single moment of dangerous decision-making, but to an ongoing environment in which a child's welfare was systematically disregarded. These are in many ways the most difficult cases for investigators and prosecutors to process, not because the evidence is unclear, but because the evidence tells a story of duration, of repetition, of a child who was in harm's way not for a moment, but for an extended period during which intervention remained possible and did not occur. The case of Valeria Lynn Hamilton, investigated by Detroit police and charged by the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office following events that came to light in January of 2023, is a case of this kind. It is a case involving two young children, one of whom did not survive, and one of whom survived with injuries that investigators and medical professionals described as severe and consistent with prolonged mistreatment. Ethan Belcher was 5 years old. He was Valeria Hamilton's son, a child in the earliest years of formal education, at the age where children are typically in kindergarten or the first grade, learning to read and write, forming their first sustained friendships outside the family, developing the foundational academic skills that will support everything that follows. He was 5 years old, and he should have been building that foundation. Instead, the medical findings presented to Wayne County prosecutors and the evidence documented at the scene by Detroit police established that Ethan had been living in conditions of severe harm inside the family's Detroit home, conditions involving both physical injury and deprivation that the investigative record characterized as a sustained pattern rather than a single incident. He lost his life as a result of the injuries and conditions he had been subjected to. He was 5 years old, and he deserved every year of the future that was taken from him. Ethan's younger brother was 3 years old at the time investigators became involved with the Hamilton household. He was the second child in the home, younger than Ethan by 2 years, at an age of profound developmental vulnerability where the quality of care a child receives shapes everything from neurological development to emotional regulation to the formation of the basic trust that healthy human relationships require. He survived. His survival was itself a consequence of the investigative and medical response that followed the discovery of Ethan's death. A response that brought child welfare investigators and medical professionals into contact with a child who was alive, but whose condition, as documented by those professionals, reflected the environment he had been living in. The injuries he had sustained required medical treatment, and the broader circumstances of his care required the immediate intervention of Wayne County's child welfare system. Valeria Hamilton was not alone in the household. The children's stepfather was also present in the home and, according to the Wayne County investigation, also involved in the pattern of harm that the evidence documented. The investigation conducted by Detroit police and Wayne County law enforcement established that the circumstances in the Hamilton home were not the product of one adult's conduct, but of a shared household environment in which two adults were present and both were implicated in what had been happening to Ethan and his younger brother. The Wayne County Prosecutor's Office made the determination to charge both Valeria Hamilton and the stepfather in connection with what had been done to the two boys. The charges filed against both individuals reflect the full scope of the evidentiary record: charges of felony murder, conspiracy to commit harm, and first-degree child abuse that capture not only the outcome of Ethan's death, but the sustained nature of the pattern that preceded it and the involvement of both adults in creating and maintaining the conditions that produced that outcome. The charges filed by the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office reflect the office's careful assessment of everything the investigation had produced. The medical evidence, the forensic documentation of the scene, the condition of the surviving younger child, and the full timeline of the household's circumstances all contributed to a charging decision that was designed to hold both adults fully accountable for the totality of what had occurred. Not just the final, fatal outcome, but the sustained course of conduct that led to it. The investigation into the Hamilton case was one that Wayne County's child welfare and law enforcement communities reflected on carefully and at length in the aftermath of its discovery. 5-year-old Ethan and his 3-year-old brother had been living in a Detroit home. The question of what systems had or had not been in contact with the family, of what opportunities for intervention had existed in the weeks and months before January of 2023, of whether there had been interactions with schools, medical providers, child welfare agencies, or community organizations that had not resulted in the formal investigation that might have reached Ethan sooner, is part of the institutional review that Wayne County's child welfare and law enforcement infrastructure conducted in response to this case. Those reviews, and the policy discussions they generated, were a part of the community's effort to understand what must be done differently to ensure that another child does not experience what Ethan experienced. Ethan Belcher was 5 years old. He was at the age where the world is beginning to open up, where school and friendships and learning are the substance of daily life, where a child begins to understand that they are an individual with their own thoughts and preferences and capabilities. He deserved every day of that opening. He deserved the safety and nurturing that would have allowed him to grow into the person he was becoming. The Wayne County Prosecutor's Office's charges against Valeria Hamilton and the stepfather represent the legal system's effort to deliver the accountability that Ethan's death and his brother's survival demand, to hold accountable, through the full weight of Michigan's criminal statutes, the adults who were responsible for what happened in that Detroit home in January of 2023. For anyone who is concerned about a child's safety or welfare, the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline, 1-800-422-4453, is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Early intervention, the kind that reaches a child before the harm becomes irreversible, is the most powerful tool a community has. The Hamilton case is a reminder of what is at stake when that intervention does not arrive in time, and of the obligation that rests on every person in a community to take seriously any concern they have about a child's welfare. Please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Ethan's story, and the story of his younger brother who survived, deserve to be told with the care and seriousness that this channel is committed to providing. Subscribe, leave a comment below, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Case 9, Kelli Marie Bryant, 2020 through February 2025, Oakland County Circuit Court, Pontiac, Michigan. There are cases in the documented record of Michigan's courts that do not involve a single catastrophic event, but rather a prolonged course of conduct, a sustained series of decisions and failures that accumulated over years, quietly, and without the kind of dramatic single moment that typically draws law enforcement attention, producing harm that was gradual, chronic, and ultimately severe enough to bring the full weight of Michigan's criminal law to bear on the person responsible. These cases are in many ways the ones that are hardest for the public to fully comprehend, because the harm they document did not happen all at once, because there was no single day on which everything changed, because what the evidence shows instead is a slow accumulation of neglect and deprivation that unfolded across months and years while the children at its center had no effective means of alerting anyone to what their daily lives had become. The case of Kelli Marie Bryant, prosecuted through Oakland County Circuit Court following events that unfolded over a period beginning in 2020 and continuing through February of 2025, is a case of this kind. It is a case involving 3 children, a 12-year-old, a 13-year-old, and a 15-year-old, who were left to survive in conditions that the court record describes with a specificity and a duration that makes what they endured particularly difficult to process. Kelli Marie Bryant was the mother of 3 children living in a condominium in Pontiac, Michigan, a city in Oakland County approximately 25 miles north of Detroit. The condominium was a residential space that should have provided her children with shelter, warmth, consistency, and the kind of stable domestic environment that children of their ages, early to mid-adolescence, a developmental period of particular importance for educational achievement, social development, and the formation of identity, require and deserve. At some point following 2020, Kelli Marie Bryant made a decision, not a single impulsive decision made in a moment of crisis, but a sustained, ongoing, deliberately maintained decision to remove herself from the condominium while leaving her 3 children behind. She did not arrange for a responsible adult to assume care of the children in her absence. She did not establish a support structure that would ensure their basic needs were being met. She did not maintain the kind of regular and meaningful contact that would have allowed her to monitor their welfare and respond to their needs. She simply left, and she stayed away, repeatedly, over a period that the investigative record documents as extending across years. The condominium, the children were left and deteriorated. The investigative record compiled by Oakland County law enforcement and child welfare investigators, when the case eventually came to light, described a living environment that had become filthy and unheated, a space that had degraded, over the period of Bryant's absence and neglect, into conditions that were not merely uncomfortable or substandard, but that posed genuine risks to the health and well-being of the children living in them. The physical environment of the condominium, as documented by the investigators who eventually entered it, was a material record of years of abandonment. The 3 children were not in school. This was not a matter of a brief educational disruption or a temporary gap in enrollment. They had been kept out of formal education for years. For children aged 12, 13, and 15, years out of school represents not merely an academic setback, but a fundamental deprivation of the developmental, social, and intellectual experiences that schooling provides during adolescence. They had been denied the peer relationships, the structured learning, the daily routine, and the engagement with a broader community that school represents for children of their ages. The educational gaps produced by years of non-enrollment during early and mid-adolescence are not easily closed, and the consequences of that deprivation extend well beyond academic achievement into the social and psychological dimensions of development. They were not receiving regular meals. The investigative record indicates that they survived on sporadic food deliveries, occasional drops that provided intermittent sustenance, but nothing approaching the consistent, adequate nutrition that growing adolescents require for healthy physical and cognitive development. The combination of inadequate nutrition, a deteriorating physical environment, educational deprivation, and the absence of consistent parental care or any responsible adult substitute created a cumulative picture of neglect that Oakland County investigators characterized as severe and chronic. What makes the Bryant case additionally and particularly significant in the documentary record of Michigan's criminal courts is the financial dimension that the investigation uncovered. While her 3 children were living in the conditions described above, in a filthy, unheated condominium, out of school, subsisting on sporadic food, Kelli Marie Bryant was simultaneously and continuously collecting state welfare benefits. These were not benefits that she had a general entitlement to for her own use. They were benefits that were specifically designated and disbursed for the support of her 3 children, for their food, their housing, their educational supplies, their developmental needs, the basic material requirements of 3 adolescents in her care. Over the period from 2020 through the point at which the case came to the attention of law enforcement, Bryant had collected $29,397 in state welfare benefits that were intended for children who were not receiving the support those benefits were designed to provide. The money meant for them was not reaching them. The investigation that eventually brought the Bryant case into Oakland County's legal system documented both dimensions of what the evidence had uncovered: the conditions in which the children had been living, established through the accounts of the children themselves, and the physical documentation of the condominium, and the financial record of the welfare benefits that had been collected over the same period. The charges that followed reflected both the child welfare dimension and the financial dimension of what Bryant had done. In the legal proceedings that followed, Kelli Marie Bryant entered a no-contest plea to welfare fraud in the latter part of 2025. A no-contest plea, known in legal terminology as a nolo contendere plea, means that the defendant does not admit guilt but accepts the legal consequence of the charge without contesting it. In this context, it was Bryant's formal acknowledgement of the financial dimension of the case, the collection of $29,397 in welfare benefits intended for children who were not receiving the support that money was meant to provide. The criminal proceedings then continued to address the child welfare dimension of what the investigation had established: the conditions in the condominium, the years of educational deprivation, the chronic absence of adequate nutrition and parental care. In April of 2026, Kelli Marie Bryant was convicted of first-degree child abuse in Oakland County Circuit Court. The conviction represented the court's formal determination that what Bryant had subjected her 3 children to, over a period of approximately 5 years, in a deteriorating condominium in Pontiac, met the legal standard of first-degree child abuse under Michigan law. The sentence handed down by Oakland County Circuit Court was up to 20 years in prison. It was a sentence that reflected the court's judgment about not only the severity of the conditions the children had experienced, but the extraordinary duration over which those conditions had persisted, the 5-year timeline that distinguished this case from a brief episode of neglect and placed it firmly in the category of sustained, chronic, and deliberately maintained deprivation. The 3 children at the center of the Bryant case, the 12-year-old, the 13-year-old, and the 15-year-old who had been living in those conditions, entered Michigan's child welfare system in the aftermath of the investigation. The work of addressing what they had experienced over those years, the educational gaps that represented years of missed schooling during critical developmental periods, the physical health consequences of years of inadequate nutrition and a deteriorating living environment, the psychological impact of years of parental abandonment and the absence of stable adult care, became the responsibility of Oakland County's child welfare infrastructure, the social workers and counselors and educators assigned to their cases, and the adults who took them in and committed to providing the stability and support they had been denied. The Bryant case is part of a broader and ongoing conversation in Michigan's child welfare and legal communities about the nature of chronic neglect, about the specific harm that accumulates when children are deprived not of safety in a single catastrophic event, but of the consistent, daily care, nutrition, education, and human connection that sustained healthy development requires. Chronic neglect is, in many ways, less visible than acute harm. It does not announce itself with a single dramatic moment of discovery. It builds slowly, invisibly, behind the closed doors of a private residence, accumulating damage over months and years in a way that can go unnoticed by the systems designed to identify children in danger. The Bryant case, with its 5-year documented timeline, is a stark illustration of how much harm that accumulation can produce, and of the accountability that Michigan's courts are prepared to deliver when the full scope of that harm is finally brought to light. The Oakland County Circuit Court sentence of up to 20 years reflects the court's determination that Kelli Marie Bryant's conduct, sustained over 5 years, involving 3 children at critical developmental stages, producing documented educational and physical harm, combined with the fraudulent collection of the state benefits intended to support those children, warranted a serious and substantial criminal response. It is a response that the 3 children at the center of this case deserve to receive on their behalf, and a signal from Oakland County's legal system that chronic neglect of this duration and severity will be treated with the full seriousness of Michigan's criminal statutes. Please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Stories like this one, the ones that unfold slowly, over years, without a single dramatic moment of discovery, are among the most important stories this channel tells, because they remind us that harm does not always arrive suddenly and loudly. Subscribe, leave a comment below, and ring the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Case 10, Chelsea Duperon, March 13, 2024, Wayne County Circuit Court, Detroit, Michigan. There are cases that arrive at a legal resolution not through the extended process of a trial, not through the weeks of opening statements, witness examination, cross-examination, and the careful deliberation of a jury asked to weigh competing accounts and interpretations of the evidence, but through a guilty plea that brings the proceedings to a conclusion before a jury is ever seated. A guilty plea of this kind is not a lesser form of legal resolution. It is a formal, on-the-record acknowledgement of criminal responsibility, entered before a judge, producing a conviction and a sentence that carry the same legal weight and permanence as a verdict returned after trial. The case of Chelsea Duperon, resolved in Wayne County Circuit Court following events that occurred on March 13, 2024, is a case of this kind. It is a case in which a child named Lila Castle, 8 years old, Chelsea Duperon's daughter, did not survive what happened to her in a Wayne County home. And it is a case in which the mother responsible for what happened to Lila ultimately stood before a Wayne County Circuit Court judge and entered a guilty plea that acknowledged her criminal responsibility in terms that the court accepted, producing a sentence that will define the remainder of a very significant portion of her adult life. Lila Castle was 8 years old. She was Chelsea Duperon's daughter, a child who had been growing up in Wayne County, building the early chapters of a life that had years ahead of it. She was at the age where children are fully engaged in elementary school, forming the friendships and academic habits that carry forward into middle school and beyond, developing the individual personality and interests that make each child distinct. She was 8 years old, and everything about that age implies a future, implies the continuation of a life that had barely entered its second decade. On March 13, 2024, Lila was subjected to severe physical harm inside her home in Wayne County. The injuries she sustained were serious. But the significance of what the medical professionals who later reviewed her case said, the testimony that would be offered in the context of the legal proceedings that followed, was not simply that the injuries were serious. It was something more specific and more devastating in its implications. The injuries Lila sustained on March 13, 2024, were injuries from which she could have recovered with timely medical intervention. Doctors who examined the evidence and testified in the context of the Wayne County proceedings stated with medical clarity that emergency medical care, sought promptly after the injuries occurred, would likely have saved Lila's life. The injuries, though serious, were survivable. Medical help was accessible. Emergency services were available. All of the infrastructure that exists precisely for moments when a child is in medical crisis was available and could have been reached with a phone call. Chelsea Duperon did not make that call. She did not take Lila to a hospital. She did not contact emergency services. She did not seek the medical intervention that the doctors who would later testify in Wayne County Circuit Court stated would likely have kept her daughter alive. Instead, according to the Wayne County investigative record assembled by Detroit police and the medical examiner's findings, Duperon left Lila in her bed. She remained there, in the family's home, in her bed, without medical attention, without the emergency care that her condition required, for 3 days. 3 full days. 72 hours during which Lila's condition progressed from serious but survivable to fatal. 72 hours during which the medical window that could have kept her alive slowly, irreversibly closed. 72 hours during which an 8-year-old girl lay in her bed, without the help that was available and was not sought. When law enforcement eventually became involved in the circumstances of Lila's death, when investigators arrived at the home and the Wayne County investigation began in earnest, they documented not only the physical harm Lila had sustained on March 13th, but the full 3-day timeline of what had followed. The documentation of that timeline, The evidence that established the period between Lila's injuries and her death, and the absence of any medical intervention during that period, became a central element of the Wayne County prosecution's case. It was the 3-day period of inaction, as much as the initial harm, that shaped the charge and the sentence that followed. Investigators also documented statements that Chelsea Duperon made when questioned in the course of the investigation, statements in which she described her daughter as having been possessed by malevolent spiritual forces. The claim did not constitute a legal defense that Wayne County's courts were in a position to accept as a basis for reducing or dismissing the charges. It did not provide a framework within which the 3-day absence of medical intervention could be legally justified or explained in a way that relieved Duperon of criminal responsibility. What it contributed to was a fuller record of the circumstances surrounding Lila's final days, a record that included not only the physical evidence and medical findings, but the account that Duperon herself offered of why she had not sought help for her daughter. The Wayne County Court took all of it into account. Wayne County prosecutors charged Chelsea Duperon with second-degree murder, a charge that, under Michigan law, carries a potential sentence of life in prison at the judge's discretion or a substantial term of years. Second-degree murder in Michigan requires proof that the defendant caused a death through conduct that was grossly negligent or that demonstrated a wanton disregard for human life, a standard that the Wayne County prosecution determined was met by the combination of the initial harm inflicted on Lila and the 3-day period during which Duperon withheld the medical care that doctors testified would have saved her. Chelsea Duperon made the decision not to proceed to trial. She entered a guilty plea to second-degree murder in Wayne County Circuit Court, a formal, legally binding acknowledgement, entered before the court and on the record, that what had happened to Lila Castle on and after March 13, 2024, constituted second-degree murder under Michigan law, and that Chelsea Duperon was the person criminally responsible for it. The guilty plea removed the case from the trial track and moved it directly to sentencing. The sentencing hearing in Wayne County Circuit Court took place in July of 2025. The sentence handed down by the court was 28 to 50 years in prison. The minimum term of 28 years is a substantial period of incarceration. It means that Chelsea Duperon will not be eligible for parole consideration until she has served that full minimum, a period that ensures meaningful and lasting accountability for what happened to Lila. The maximum term of 50 years reflects the upper boundary of the sentence imposed, and the range as a whole reflects the Wayne County Court's judgment about the gravity of the conduct documented in the case, the severity of the initial harm, the 3 days of withheld medical care, and the death of an 8-year-old child who, by the testimony of medical professionals, did not have to die. Lila Castle was 8 years old. She had sustained injuries that doctors testified were survivable. She was not taken to receive the care that would have saved her. She was left for 3 days. She did not survive. The Wayne County Circuit Court's sentence of 28 to 50 years is the legal system's permanent and documented statement about the accountability owed to Lila Castle, a statement about the gravity of what her mother did on March 13th and in the 3 days that followed, and about the obligation that Michigan's courts have to respond to that gravity with a sentence that reflects it fully. The Duperon case has also become part of the broader conversation in Wayne County and across Michigan about the specific and serious legal consequences that flow from the decision to withhold medical care from a child who has been harmed. The medical testimony in this case, the expert professional statements that Lila's injuries were survivable with timely emergency care, made the 3-day period of inaction the moral and legal center of the prosecution's case. It established, in terms that a Wayne County judge accepted and acted upon at sentencing, that the decision not to seek help was not a passive or neutral act, but a decision with fatal consequences, a decision for which Michigan's criminal law holds the person who made it fully accountable. For anyone in a situation where a child has been harmed and needs medical attention, calling emergency services immediately is both a legal obligation and the most fundamental moral duty that a caregiver carries. Children cannot advocate for their own medical needs. They cannot call for help on their own behalf. The adults in their lives bear that responsibility absolutely and without exception. Lila Castle deserved that advocacy. She deserved the phone call that was not made. She deserved to survive. This documentary has examined 10 cases drawn from the Detroit metropolitan area and Michigan's court records, 10 instances in which the legal system was called upon to respond to the severe harm or loss of life of children and vulnerable individuals at the hands of people who were supposed to protect them. From Wayne County Circuit Court to Oakland County, from the city of Detroit to the forests of northern Michigan, these cases span years, jurisdictions, and circumstances. What they share, the fundamental truth that unites every case in this documentary, is that the victims at their center all deserved more. They deserved protection. They deserved futures. They deserved the advocacy and the care that every child and every vulnerable person is owed by the people responsible for them. The work of documenting these cases, of telling them with accuracy and care and genuine respect for the victims and their families, is part of the larger work of building communities that protect people more effectively, that identify warning signs earlier, that intervene when intervention is still possible, that invest in the resources that reach families before a crisis becomes a tragedy, and that hold accountable, through the full weight of the legal system, those who cause irreparable harm to the most vulnerable among us. Thank you for watching Cold Case Hour. If this documentary has informed you, moved you, or brought a case to your attention that you were not previously aware of, please like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel. Hit that notification bell so you are always the first to know when a new episode is published. Your support, every subscription, every like, every comment, is what makes Cold Case Hour possible and keeps these stories being told the way they deserve to be told. The Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline is available at 1-800-422-4453, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. If you are concerned about a child's welfare, please reach out. Cold Case Hour, real cases, real courts, real verdicts.